The year was 1952, and Governor Adlai Stevenson was campaigning for the presidency against Dwight D. Eisenhower. He had just finished his speech and stepped off the podium to be greeted by one of his admirers. "Governor," she enthused, "every single thinking person out there will be voting for you." But he shook his head. "I'm afraid that's not going to be enough," he said. "I need the majority." And often we see that the majority doesn't always constitute what is best for a country, clearly being illustrated in countries that have experienced the Arab Spring, a wave of pro-revolutionary uprisings that overthrew authoritarian regimes in hopes of establishing a fairer institution in places such as Northern Africa and the Middle East. But much to the Western world's horror, many of these democratically elected governments have brought Islamic parties to power. As an article from Foreign Affairs in its March-April 2012 edition called "The Arab Spring at One" reflects, it indicates that unfortunately many of these Islamic parties have used the political process to advance their own agenda. And in places such as Egypt and Tunisia, many analysts are concerned and they fear that democracy will ultimately undermine the stability of these countries. Thus, many analysts are questioning whether democracy as a political institution is what's best and most stable for these Arab nations, which brings us to the question today. Is political Islam compatible with democracy? But the answer is a resounding no, for three reasons. First, because divisions of sectarian and religious lines lead to violence within the country. Secondly, these same divisions lead to political paralysis. And finally, extremist Islamic ideologies are ultimately counterproductive and against the ideas of democracy. Now, it may come as a surprise that there is actually a division more violent and powerful than the division between international extempors and domestic extempors. And that is the division between the Muslim faith, with the Sunnis and the Shias. We turn to an article from the BBC Profile, which was updated on December 9th of 2011, indicating that the Sunnis, with the majority, about 90% of the population, have often been at odds with the Shia minority, which make up about 10%. And this division has been responsible for great centuries of conflict that has turmoiled the Middle East. And in fact, as the article also notes, this is one of the reasons why democracy is not always compatible with political Islam, because whichever group comes to power, whether it be the Sunnis or the Shias, they ultimately exploit the other group. According to an article from the Small Wars Journal published on June 1st of this year, it indicates that even in relatively stable countries such as Lebanon, ethnic and religious divisions between the Sunnis and the Shias have led to a host of bombings and killings that have unfortunately brought uprisings within the country. And we additionally see this in the country of Iraq, which according to an article from the Extempor's Bible, or as some people call it, The Economist, published on April 14th of this year, it indicates that as the United States has withdrawn its troop presence within Iraq, we've seen a surge of instability related to Shiite bombings and sectarian violence. Ultimately, the government is unable to control this violence, and sometimes the government is even complicit in it. We see that while it may appear temporarily that in such democracies political Islam is compatible, but as Western influence fades and we withdraw from these countries, violence resurges once again. And in fact, these divisions are also responsible for political paralysis within these countries, which ultimately undermines a stable development of these countries themselves. In fact, as actor and comedian Larry Hardiman once pointed out, the word politics is derived from the word poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasites, which unfortunately can also describe the corruption and political problems within Iraq. As the article from The Economist continues on April 14th of this year, it indicates that divisions within the Islam government between the Shia party and the Sunnis who control parliament, there's often a lack of agenda setting and a lack of political processes that are going on. Much like the Democrats and the Republicans, political divisions lead to paralysis and deadlock in which countries such as Iraq cannot move forward in terms of developing their institutions because their political parties can't agree on anything. And in fact, we also see that in countries such as Egypt, where it appears that in the short term, perhaps Islamic agendas are compatible with democracy, this is not the case either, as this is not a sustainable trend. As an article from the New York Times published yesterday indicates, Egypt, despite successfully democratically electing a Muslim Brotherhood parliament, it unfortunately was overturned, and parliament was completely dissolved by the courts just yesterday. And unfortunately, it seems that these countries will be headed for a rough transition in terms of becoming a developing nation. And speaking of rough transitions, here's my third point. In this third point of analysis, we see that political Islam is ultimately uncompatible because many of the ideologies of political Islam are counter to Western ideologies of democracy and fairness for all. As an article published in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a paper published in June of 2012 indicates, unfortunately with many Islamic parties, it appears in the short term that they are stable and that they are actually helping democracy. But as the article points out, in situations such as Hamas, an organization within the Gaza Strip and Israel, they are only using this in the short term to appear that they are going with the political process, while actually using this as a means to achieve their ultimate ends, which is a Sharia law and an Islamic state. As an article from the think tank, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, published on June 8th of this year, indicates, unfortunately, many of these Islamic parties want to establish Sharia law, which is counterproductive to the rights of women, and unfortunately also counterproductive to the rights of democracy. Thus, when we return to the question today, is political Islam compatible with democracy, we see that the answer is a resounding no. First, because ethnic and sectarian tensions lead to violence and political paralysis, and additionally, it is ideologically opposed to our values of free speech and democracy. It seems that the thinking sector of the population doesn't always constitute the majority. Just ask Adlai Stevenson. Thank you.
Fourth speaker will be cross-examined by number 280.
Congratulations. In your first point, you discussed how Sunni and Shia political Islamic parties often lead to trouble. But throughout the Middle East, Salafist Muslims and Alawite Muslims are also prevalent in countries such as Egypt and Syria. How do these parties contribute to democracy or reduce it?
I would argue that these parties that you cite actually make democracy worse. For example, the Alawite Party and the Salafist Party, which you cite, are ultimately sects of Islamism that are extremely idealistic and extremely, well, extreme. In fact, according to an article from the Small Worlds Journal, which I cited in my first point of analysis, it indicates that such parties, for example, the Salafist Party within Tunisia, are ultimately tilting the rather conservative and moderate Islamic Party and making their views more extreme and ultimately forcing the country to embark on a more Islamic state.
In your second point, you remarked that often these Islamic parties resort to political paralysis. Yet in many cases, whether it be in Syria, Iran, or other countries around the Middle East, Alawites, Shias, and other sects have come together to form stable regimes that last for quite a long time. How do these parties also lead to political paralysis if they lead to functioning governments?
I think your question rests on a few incorrect assumptions. Namely, you say that Iran and Syria are stable, which is like saying that I would look good in a pantsuit or a bowl cut. Neither of these things are true.
When the cases I mentioned, Syria is still a powerful country. The regime is still, although it is brutalizing its people, it's still in power. Although, yes, this leads to political paralysis, can't political Islam still be relevant in the Middle East?
I think that once again the example you cite of Syria disproves this. As an article from the New York Times published yesterday indicates, the violence in Syria has claimed more than 15,000 lives and has perpetuated a civil war among sectarian lines between the Sunni rebels and the Shia government, which sounds a lot familiar to the sectarian tensions and how political Islam is ultimately non-compatible with democracy in the Middle East.